The wind on the upper deck didn't just blow, it bit, sharp and relentless, tearing through the thin layers of my coat. Good. I needed the cold to numb the memory of the last 48 hours. Back in the city, my name was currently trending for all the wrong reasons. A gallery opening imploded, a reputation incinerated, and a life left in ashes. Here, on this rusting ferry cutting through the black water, I was just a silhouette in the fog. The air smelled of diesel and salt, thick enough to taste. I fumbled for a cigarette, hands shaking, when a flame suddenly sparked in the darkness. It illuminated a sharp jawline, a worn collar, and eyes that seemed to see right through the mist. The vibration of the engine hummed through the metal railing, a low, constant growl that matched the churning in my stomach. We were the only two foolish enough to be out here. The observation deck was slick with mist, the lights from the cabin reduced to hazy yellow blurs behind the glass. She didn't say anything at first, just held the lighter steady, cupping the flame against the wind. I leaned in, the tip of my cigarette catching the fire, and took a drag that burned my lungs in the best way possible. When I pulled back, the light died, but the afterimage of her face lingered. She wore a leather jacket that had seen better decades, the elbows scuffed white, the collar turned up against the chill. She wasn't dressed for a casual crossing. She looked like she'd been traveling for days. "You look like you're trying to outrun the boat," she said. Her voice was low, textured like gravel and velvet. It wasn't a question. I exhaled a plume of smoke that was instantly snatched away by the gale. "Maybe the boat is too slow," I countered, keeping my tone clipped. I wasn't in the mood for conversation, especially not with someone who looked like they could read the tension in my shoulders from 10 feet away. She leaned back against the railing, unbothered by the spray. "Nothing outruns a ferry this late," she murmured. "It just delays the inevitable." She shifted closer, ostensibly to block the wind, but the sudden reduction of space between us felt deliberate. The air around her smelled of old rain, faint tobacco, and something sharper, like ozone before a storm. It was intoxicating. My own scent, expensive perfume and panic, felt artificial in comparison. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was damp, plastered to her forehead in dark waves, and her eyes were dark, intelligent, and tired. Not the exhaustion of sleep deprivation, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who carries too many other people's secrets. "Running away or running toward?" I asked, surprising myself. Usually, I kept my guard up like a fortress wall. She smirked, a small, crooked thing that made my breath hitch. "Running from," she corrected. "Same as you." I stiffened. "I'm just taking a vacation." Her laugh was short and dry. People on vacation don't stand on the windward side of a ferry at 2 a.m., gripping the railing like they're afraid to let go. She didn't say it with judgment. She said it with recognition. It was a truce offered in the dark. Two refugees from the mainland, suspended in the gray space between where we were and where we were going. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the biting cold. It would have been easy to step away, to retreat to the warmth of the cabin, but I found myself rooted to the spot. The proximity was dangerous. I knew nothing about her, not her name, not her story, but the way she watched me, unflinching, steady, made me feel seen in a way the paparazzi flashes back home never did. We stood there as the fog swirled around us, erasing the horizon, erasing the consequences. For a moment, the scandal didn't exist. The gallery didn't exist. There was just the hum of the engine, the taste of salt, and the undeniable pull of a stranger who smelled like a storm. The spell broke with the crackle of the intercom. "Approaching North Point, foot passengers, please proceed to the lower deck." The sudden noise made us both jump. She pushed off the railing, the distance between us opening up like a physical wound. "Reality calls," she said softly. The change in the ferry's vibration was the first warning. The deep, chest-rattling thrum of the open ocean engines dropped to a lower, more guttural growl as the captain reversed thrust to slow our approach. The sudden shift in momentum threw us slightly off balance, or maybe that was just me, feeling the solid ground of my escape plan turning into vapor. The foghorns bellowed again, closer this time, bouncing off the invisible cliffs of the island. That sound usually signaled safety, arrival. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. "We're docking," I said, the words tasting like ash. I didn't want to move. The bubble of anonymity we had created on this wind-scoured deck felt safer than whatever waited for me on land. She didn't look at the shoreline. She was still looking at me, her gaze heavy, dissecting the panic I was trying so hard to suppress. "You don't have a plan, do you?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a clinical observation, delivered with that same gravel-rough softness. I laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I have a rental key and a desire to be invisible. That's a plan." "That's a wish," she corrected. She turned fully toward me then, her back to the sea, blocking the wind. The sudden shelter made the air around us feel instantly warmer, more intimate. "I'm not much better. I'm here chasing a ghost." "A ghost?" "Something that doesn't want to be found," she said, her eyes darkening. "Something that changes shape every time I get close." The air thickened, charged with more than just the impending storm. The distance between us had shrunk to inches, a proximity that should have been alarming with a stranger in the dark, but instead felt inevitable. My hand was still gripping the freezing metal of the railing, my knuckles white. She looked down at it, then slowly, deliberately, placed her hand over mine. Her skin was shocking against the cold, rough, warm, and steady. The contact wasn't tentative, it was a grounding wire. The heat of her palm seeped into my frozen fingers, and I felt the tension in my chest coil tight, then suddenly snap. I should have pulled away. I should have made a polite excuse and retreated to the stairwell. But the pull was undeniable. It was gravity, plain and simple. "You're shaking," she murmured, her thumb brushing the back of my hand. "It's the cold," I lied. "You're a terrible liar," she whispered. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, and then dropped to my mouth. The invitation was silent, heavy, and reckless. I didn't think about the scandal back home. I didn't think about the cameras or the gallery or the ruin of my reputation. I just leaned in. The kiss wasn't soft. It was a collision. It was the desperate, starving contact of two people who had been running on empty for too long. She tasted of bitter coffee and the sharp, clean bite of mint, with an underlying note of the salt spray that clung to us both. Her other hand came up to cup my jaw, her fingers tangling in my wind-knotted hair, holding me there like she was afraid I'd turn into mist if she let go. I made a low sound in my throat, half gasp, half surrender, and gripped the lapels of her worn leather jacket. The leather was cold and slick under my palms, a stark contrast to the heat of her mouth. This wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a claiming. For a few suspended seconds, the world narrowed down to the rough slide of her jacket, the pressure of her body pressing me against the railing, and the consuming, sultry rhythm of her lips moving against mine. It was a release of weeks of held breath, a physical purging of the tension that had been eating me alive. Then the ferry slammed into the harbor bumpers with a violent, metal-groaning shudder. The world tilted back on its axis. We broke apart, chests heaving, eyes wide. The spell shattered as the deck lights flooded to full brightness, exposing us. The intercom blared a final arrival sequence. She looked at me, her lips swollen, her eyes searching mine for a second. just a second, before the mask slammed back down. "Go," she said, her voice rougher than before the foot traffic starts. She didn't ask for my name. She didn't offer hers. She just stepped back, turning her collar up against the wind, becoming a stranger again. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I walked down the metal ramp and onto the solid, wet wood of the dock, my legs feeling like jelly. The island air was still and smelled of pine and damp earth. I touched my lips, still tingling, still tasting of her. I convinced myself it was just a moment, a glitch in the universe, a singular, isolated event that would stay on the water, swallowed by the fog, never to be repeated. I was safe here. I was anonymous. And I would never see her again. My sanctuary turned out to be a drafty A-frame perched on a granite cliff that felt like the jagged edge of the world. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the climate-controlled, glass-walled penthouse I had abandoned in the city. Here, the heating system was a temperamental wood stove I barely knew how to operate, and the wind rattled the single-pane windows with a violence that made sleep impossible. I traded Egyptian cotton for scratchy wool, and the ambient hum of the city for the relentless, crashing roar of the Atlantic. But it was private. It was isolated, and for the first 24 hours, that was the only currency that mattered. I spent the day exploring the small, gray coastal town, wrapping myself in the anonymity of a heavy coat and a lowered gaze. The town clung to the coastline like barnacles on a ship's hull, weathered, stubborn, and indifferent to outsiders. I bought groceries from a cashier who didn't look up from her phone. I walked along the pebble beach, letting the freezing spray numb my face. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe the illusion. I convinced myself that the scandal couldn't swim, that the headlines burning through the mainland couldn't reach this far across the water. I was just a woman in a coat, not a disgraced gallery owner or a social pariah. I was safe. By the second night, however, the silence of the cabin began to feel less like peace and more like a cage. My own thoughts were too loud in the empty room, replaying the Ferry encounter on a loop, the rough slide of leather, the taste of mint, the desperate heat of that kiss. I needed noise. I needed to be around people who didn't know my name. I drove down to the only place open past 8, a pub called the Rusty Anchor. It was exactly what I needed. Dim, smelling of stale beer and frying oil, and loud with the chatter of locals. I found a small table in the back corner, shadowed and inconspicuous, and ordered a burger and a whiskey. The warmth of the room began to thaw the ice in my chest. I took a sip of the drink, feeling the burn settle in my stomach, and finally relaxed my shoulders. Then the television mounted above the bar changed channels. The low murmur of the room didn't stop, but for me, the sound cut through the air like a siren. The local news broadcast had shifted to a national segment. My face, high resolution and unflattering, flashed onto the screen. The chyron read, "Art world scandal widens." The anchor's voice was tinny but distinct. Whereabouts of gallery owner Elena Vance remain unknown following allegations of... I froze, my hand tightening around the whiskey glass until my knuckles turned white. I felt the heat of a dozen imaginary eyes burning into me. I lowered my head, using my hair as a curtain, praying for the segment to end, praying for invisibility. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that signaled a new arrival. A gust of wet wind swept through the room, chilling the air. I glanced up instinctively, ready to bolt, and felt the blood drain from my face. It was her, the stranger from the Ferry. She was still wearing that worn leather jacket, now darkened by the fresh rain. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp line of her jaw that I had traced with my eyes only hours ago. But the weary resilience I had seen on the deck was gone, replaced by a focused, predatory energy. She didn't look like a tourist stumbling in for shelter. She walked to the bar with purpose. "The usual, Sarah?" the bartender asked, not even looking up as he reached for a bottle. Sarah. She had a name. And she had a history here. "Double, no ice," she replied. Her voice was the same, gravel and velvet, but the tone was different. It was professional. She didn't sit. She pulled a phone from her pocket, her eyes scanning the room, sliding right over my dark corner without pausing. She pressed the phone to her ear, turning slightly so her profile was illuminated by the flickering light of the TV, the same TV that had just broadcast my ruin. I held my breath, trapped in the shadows. "I'm on the island," she said into the phone, her voice low but carrying clearly over the lull in conversation. "Yeah, I know the editor is pushing. Tell him to relax." She paused, listening, and her eyes narrowed. "I'm tracking the lead now. If Vance is hiding anywhere on this coast, I'll find her. The gallery piece is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to break the whole story." The world stopped. The whiskey in my stomach turned to acid. She wasn't just a stranger. She wasn't a fellow refugee running from her own ghosts. She was the press. The woman I had kissed, the woman whose touch had been the only real thing I'd felt in weeks, was the journalist sent to destroy me. The instinct to run was primal, a sudden spike of adrenaline that flooded my veins and made my hands tremble. I didn't finish the whiskey. I didn't wait for the bill. I just needed out. I needed the cold, dark anonymity of the street before Sarah finished her call and turned those sharp, intelligent eyes toward the corner where I was trying to shrink into the shadows. I slid out of the booth, keeping my head down, measuring the distance to the door. It was 20 feet. 20 feet of exposed, well-lit floorboards between me and salvation. I moved fast, hugging the wall, using a group of fishermen as a temporary shield. I was almost there. I could see the condensation on the glass of the exit door, could almost feel the bite of the wind waiting on the other side. My hand reached for the brass handle. "Small island," a voice said, right behind my ear. I froze. The voice wasn't loud, but it was distinct. That same low, textured rasp that had unraveled me on the ferry. It vibrated through my spine. I didn't turn around immediately. I took a breath, trying to force my heart back down into my chest, trying to compose a face that wasn't terrified. When I finally turned, she was there, leaning against the doorframe, blocking my path with a casual arrogance that made my mouth go dry. She wasn't smiling. The phone was gone, tucked away into that worn leather jacket, but her eyes were alert, scanning my face with a professional detachment that was infinitely worse than anger. She knew. The recognition wasn't dawning. It had already dawned. The mask was off. "I didn't think the vacation story would hold up," she said softly, her gaze dropping to my hands, which were clenched at my sides. "But I didn't expect to find the headline sitting in the back of a dive bar on a Tuesday." "I don't know who you think I am," I lied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my head. Sarah tilted her head, a shark sensing blood in the water. "Don't insult me, Elena. I've spent the last 3 weeks studying your face. I know the timeline of the gallery collapse better than you do. I know about the wire transfers, the forged provenance papers, the way you left the city without telling your lawyer." She took a step closer, invading my personal space. The familiar heat radiating from her body hit me again, triggering a confusing, visceral memory of her mouth on mine. "Why this island specifically? Why run to the edge of the map?" "Because I needed silence," I snapped, the defense slipping out before I could stop it. "Away from people like you." "People like me?" She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You mean the press? Or do you mean the stranger who lit your cigarette?" The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. She had played the card. She knew she had the leverage. She had the power to destroy me right here, to shout my name to the room, to call her editor and end my life with a single phone call. But she wasn't doing that. She was keeping her voice low, intimate. She was hoarding the secret. You weren't thinking about headlines on that deck, I countered, lowering my voice to match hers. I stepped into her space, a reckless gamble. If she was going to play cat and mouse, I wasn't going to be an easy kill. Sarah's eyes darkened. For a second, her composure crystallized into something harder. Her gaze flickered to my lips, then back up to my eyes, unflinching. That was off the clock. This? She gestured vaguely between us. This is work. And you just became my biggest lead. So, what happens now? I asked, challenging her. You expose me to the room? You take a picture for the morning edition? I could, she murmured. She leaned in, her forearm resting on the door above my head, effectively pinning me in the corner. The proximity was suffocating and electric. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, the tension coiling tight in the small space between us. It was a threat, but it was confusingly erotic. The way she looked at me wasn't just about the story. It was about possession. She had caught me, and she wanted me to know it. I could ruin you right now, she whispered, her face inches from mine. I could write the piece that buries you. But I want the truth, Elena, and you're going to give it to me. And if I don't, then you'll find out just how small this island really is. Her eyes held mine, challenging, hungry. The fear was real, but the pull was stronger. I wanted to push her away, but I also wanted to grab the lapels of that jacket and drag her back down to me. The conflict paralyzed me. Excuse me, I said, my voice barely a breath. Sarah didn't move for a long beat. She let the silence stretch, heavy and loaded, letting the reality of her power settle over me. Then, slowly, she stepped back, clearing the path to the door. Run all you want, she said, her voice following me as I pushed the door open. I'll still be here when you get tired. I stumbled out into the night, the cold wind hitting my flushed face like a slap. I walked fast, my boots striking the pavement, but the town that had felt like a sanctuary suddenly felt like a cage. And the worst part wasn't the fear of exposure. It was the terrifying realization that part of me didn't want to run at all. The Atlantic storm hit with the subtlety of a freight train, slamming into the coast shortly after I fled the pub. It wasn't just rain. It was a wall of water that erased the world, turning the ocean into a churning gray violence and the sky into a bruised purple ceiling. By midnight, the ferries were canceled indefinitely. By 2 a.m., the power lines on the main roads snapped like dry twigs, plunging the entire north side of the island into absolute, suffocating darkness. My A-frame cabin, already drafty, became a tomb. The electric heat died instantly. The wind screamed through the gaps in the window frames, and the temperature inside plummeted until I could see my breath pluming in the beam of my flashlight. I tried to wait it out, wrapped in every blanket I could find, but the isolation was heavier than the cold. I wasn't just freezing. I was alone with the knowledge that my hunter was on the island, waiting for the weather to clear to finish me off. By morning, the hunger and the chill drove me out. I navigated the slick, debris-strewn roads to the only place on the island that had a generator industrial enough to defy the grid: the combination general store and cafe near the harbor. The windows glowed with a warm, yellow defiance against the gray morning. I pushed through the door, desperate for coffee and heat, and stopped dead. Of course, Sarah was sitting at the only table near the power strip, a tangle of charging cables snake-like around her boots. Her laptop was open, a camera battery charger was blinking rhythmically, and a half-eaten scone sat on a napkin. She looked up the moment the bell chimed. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had been waiting for the inevitable gravity of the situation to pull me into her orbit. The cafe was crowded with locals seeking warmth, leaving only one empty chair. It was directly across from her. I hesitated, dripping water onto the worn linoleum, weighing the humiliation of retreat against the necessity of warmth. "The coffee is fresh," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. She kicked the empty chair out with her boot. "And the generator is loud enough to drown out a conversation, if you're worried about eavesdroppers." I walked over and sat down, unwinding my scarf with deliberate slowness. "I'm not worried about them," I said, keeping my voice low. "I'm worried about what you're typing." "Notes," she said, closing the laptop but not moving it. "Background. Context." "Lies," I corrected. "I don't write lies, Elena. I write what I see." She leaned back, her eyes scanning my face, taking in the dark circles, the lack of makeup, the raw exhaustion. And right now, I see someone who's used to controlling the narrative, realizing she's lost the script. "You think you know me because you read a police report and a few gossip columns," I shot back. The proximity was doing that thing again, making my skin prickle. The air between us smelled of damp wool, dark roast coffee, and the ozone charge of the storm. "You think I'm some entitled socialite who played with investors' money, aren't you?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee, her gaze unflinching. "You ran. Innocent people don't run to the edge of the map in the middle of winter. Innocent people run when they're being framed by partners who have been in the business for 30 years, I hissed, leaning over the table. "I didn't sign those transfers. I was the face. I was the gallery curator, the aesthetic, the brand. I wasn't the accountant. But when the money vanished, I was the only one left standing in the spotlight." Sarah paused. Her expression didn't soften, but the sharpness in her eyes shifted, calculating. She looked at me not as a subject, but as a puzzle that wasn't fitting together. "The partner. David's? He's in the Caymans. I'm in a drafty cabin with a journalist who wants to mount my head on a wall to get a byline in a national paper." The accusation hung there. Outside, the rain lashed against the plate glass, blurring the world into streaks of gray. The power lines had snapped, leaving us with only the generator's hum and the unavoidable gravity of each other. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were strong, bare, calloused, working hands, not the manicured hands of the critics I was used to. "I hate the hit pieces," she admitted quietly, the gravel in her voice dropping an octave. "I hate tearing people down for clicks. It's cheap, but it pays the rent." "So my life is your rent money?" "Your life is a story," she said, meeting my eyes again. "Whether I write it or someone else does." "But," she hesitated, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then back up, the professional distance cracking under the weight of the attraction that had been simmering since the ferry. "I'm starting to think the story isn't what I thought it was." I held her gaze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The intellectual sparring was fading, replaced by a different kind of hunger. The table was small. Her knees brushed mine under the wood, and neither of us pulled away. The storm had locked us in, and the walls were coming down. The storm broke in the early afternoon, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy. The wind stopped screaming. The rain reduced to a rhythmic, dripping cadence from the eaves, and the world outside the cabin window returned to a stillness that was almost unnerving. I was trying to coax a dying flame back to life in the wood stove when the knock came. It wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor checking in. It was 3 sharp raps, decisive, professional. I opened the door to find Sarah standing on the wet porch. The leather jacket was gone, replaced by a thick wool coat that made her look softer, less armored, though her eyes were just as guarded. She held a small black case in one hand and a notepad in the other. "I need a statement," she said. No pleasantries. No acknowledgement of the moment in the cafe where her knee had pressed against mine. If I'm going to pitch the counter-narrative to my editor, I need you on the record, officially. I stepped back, holding the door open. Come in. The cabin was small, a single room dominated by the stove and the bed, and her presence filled it instantly. She moved to the small pine table near the window, setting down her equipment with practiced efficiency. She placed a digital recorder between us, the small device looking like a grenade waiting to go off. She pressed a button, and a tiny red light blinked to life. An unblinking eye. State your name and your role at the Vance Gallery, she said, her voice flattening into a reporter's monotone. I sat across from her. Elena Vance, owner, curator. Did you authorize the transfer of funds on November 14th? No. Did you have knowledge of the offshore accounts prior to the indictment? No. It started like that. Clinical, rhythmic, a tennis match of accusations and denials. Sarah watched me as I spoke, her gaze tracking the micro-expressions on my face, looking for the tell, the lie. But as the minutes ticked by, the questions began to drift. The professional veneer started to crack, revealing the curiosity underneath. Why didn't you fight back immediately? She asked, leaning forward slightly. The recorder hummed between us. Why run? Why come here, specifically? I needed silence, I said. I needed to hear my own thoughts. And what do they sound like? Sarah asked softly. The thoughts? I looked at her. That wasn't a question for a financial scandal piece. That was a question for a profile, for something intimate. They sound like regret, I admitted. For trusting the wrong people. For being so focused on the art that I didn't see the frame was rotting. The red light blinked. Sarah didn't write that down. She was staring at me, her pupils blown wide in the dim light of the cabin. The air in the room shifted, thickening. You're not objective, I said quietly. It was a challenge. Sarah stiffened. I'm doing my job. Are you? I nodded at the recorder. Does your editor know about the Ferry? Does he know that the subject of your investigation tasted like mint and desperation 3 nights ago? Sarah's jaw tightened. The reference to the kiss hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. She looked at the recorder, then back at me. The conflict warred behind her eyes. The duty to the story versus the reality of the pull between us. Sarah reached out. Her hand hovered over the device for a split second, trembling slightly, before her finger came down on the stop button. Click. The red light died. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. Off the record, she said, her voice rough, stripped of the reporter's cadence. Off the record, I agreed. She stood up, and I stood with her. The table was narrow. We were inches apart. Sarah didn't step back. She stepped in. Her hands came up, not to take notes, but to rest on my waist, her thumbs pressing into the fabric of my sweater, grounding me. I'm supposed to be finding the cracks in your story, she whispered, her gaze dropping to my mouth. I'm supposed to be exposing you. You found the cracks, I breathed, my hands finding purchase on her shoulders. I'm right here. The tension was unbearable. It wasn't the frantic, adrenaline-fueled collision of the Ferry. This was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly real. I could feel the heat of her palms seeping through my clothes, could count the eyelashes framing her dark eyes. She leaned in, her breath warm against my neck, her nose brushing the sensitive skin below my ear. I tilted my head back, inviting it, wanting it. This is a mistake, she murmured against my skin. Probably, I whispered back. She froze. The words seemed to snap something in her, a realization of the stakes, of the line we were obliterating. She pulled back abruptly, her hands leaving my waist as if burned. Her chest was heaving, her composure shattered. I can't, she said, her voice shaking. She grabbed the recorder, shoving it into her pocket without its case. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. I can't do this. Not yet. She turned and bolted for the door, tearing it open and disappearing into the gray afternoon, leaving me standing in the center of the room, my skin still burning where she had touched me. The betrayal didn't come with a shout or a siren. It came with the soft, rhythmic clatter of a keyboard. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the island scrubbed clean and raw under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. I had walked into town, foolishly hoping that the intimacy of the previous afternoon had bought me time, or perhaps mercy. I told myself that the way Sarah's hands had lingered on my waist meant something more than just a momentary lapse in judgment. But when I passed the window of the small library cafe, the only place with reliable internet, I stopped dead. Sarah was there. She was hunched over her laptop, her posture rigid, her fingers flying across the keys with a violence that looked like an execution. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't staring out the window in moral conflict. She was writing. She was working. To my terrified eyes, she looked like a hunter who had finally cornered her prey and was currently field dressing the kill. The nausea hit me instantly. How long had she been planning this? Had yesterday just been a tactic to get me to lower my guard? I didn't go in. I turned away before she could see me, before I could see her eyes go flat and cold as she justified destroying my life for a byline. I walked back to the A-frame in record time. I didn't bother folding my clothes. I threw them into my duffel bag with shaking hands. Sweaters, jeans, the few books I'd bought, shoving them down until the zipper strained. I left the perishables in the fridge. I left the deposit on the counter. I just needed to be gone before the story went live, before the few locals who had treated me with indifference started looking at me with recognition and disgust. The ferry schedule was sparse, but there was a cargo run at noon that took foot passengers. I stood on the end of the wooden dock, the wind whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. The smell of diesel and brine was thick here, a sensory echo of the night we met. It felt like a cruel bookend. I had arrived in fog and hope. I was leaving in clarity and ruin. "Elena!" The shout was swallowed by the wind, but I heard it. My stomach dropped. I didn't turn. I stared at the horizon where the gray shape of the ferry was slowly growing larger, a sluggish beast crawling toward me. "Elena, stop." Footsteps pounded on the hollow wood of the dock. Sarah. She sounded breathless, desperate. I gripped the strap of my bag tighter, my knuckles white. "Don't," I said, finally turning to face her. "Don't come here and pretend you're sorry. I saw you." Sarah stopped 10 feet away. She looked wrecked. Her coat was unbuttoned, her hair wild from the wind, her chest heaving. She didn't look like a predator now. She looked like someone who had been running just as hard as I had. "I wasn't writing the story," she said, her voice rough. "I saw you," I spat back, the anger finally overriding the fear. "You were relentless." "I was writing my resignation," she shouted, the words tearing out of her throat. The silence that followed was louder than the waves slapping against the pilings. "What?" I whispered. Sarah took a step closer, her hands open, empty. I called my editor. He told me to file the hit piece or clear out my desk. He wants the scandal, Elena. He wants the villain. She shook her head, her eyes dark and intense, locking onto mine. But I couldn't give him that, because I don't see a villain. I see a woman who was framed. I see someone who is trying to survive. "You quit?" "I'm going to write the truth," she admitted, her voice dropping to that low, sultry register that made my knees weak. "Not the scandal, the truth." She closed the distance between us. The air around us charged, electric and heavy, ignoring the biting cold of the dock. "I can't destroy you, Elena. I'd rather destroy my career." I looked at her, really looked at her. There was no deception in her face, only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. She had chosen me. In a world that had stripped me of everything, this woman, this stranger who knew my secrets, had chosen me. I dropped my bag. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "You're an idiot," I said, my voice shaking. "I know," she murmured. She reached for me, and this time, I didn't freeze. I stepped into her, my hands finding the lapels of her coat, pulling her down. The second kiss wasn't like the first. The first had been a fantasy, a collision in the dark. This one was grounded in the harsh, gray light of reality. It was desperate and claiming, tasting of salt spray and the terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to run anymore. Her arms wrapped around me, crushing me against her, acting as a shield against the wind, the world, and the future. I buried my hands in her hair, deepening the kiss, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against my chest, matching my own. The ferry loomed closer, its engine vibrating through the wood beneath our feet, but we didn't move. We stood there, on the edge of the Atlantic, anchored by nothing but each other, while the boat that was supposed to be my escape came and went without me. The truce held until we crossed the threshold of the cabin, the heavy wooden door shutting out the wind and the roar of the ocean. But the silence inside didn't last. It was shattered almost immediately by the vibration of Sarah's phone against the pine table. It buzzed with the relentless, angry rhythm of a device that had been ignored for too long. Sarah stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. The name Miller flashed in bold letters. She reached out to silence it, her hand hovering. But the buzzing stopped, only to start again 2 seconds later. "Answer it," I said, leaning against the counter, still shivering slightly from the dock. "He's not going to stop." Sarah exhaled, a sharp sound of frustration, and swiped the screen. She didn't put it on speaker, but in the small, quiet room, she didn't have to. The voice on the other end was tinny, loud, and dripping with venom. "You don't get to resign in the middle of a lead, Sarah," the voice barked. "I don't care about your moral crisis. I care about the deadline. You're on that island, you found her, and if you don't file the story by tomorrow morning, you're done. I'll make sure you never sell a byline in this city again. You'll be blacklisted before the ferry even docks." Sarah's eyes met mine, apologetic and weary. "I told you, Miller. I'm out. The story isn't what we thought." "Then write what it is! Or are you too busy protecting a criminal to do your job?" Sarah hung up. She didn't say goodbye. She just severed the connection and tossed the phone onto the sofa like it was contaminated. She ran a hand through her wind-tangled hair, turning away from me to stare out the darkened window. The tension in her shoulders was a physical weight. She had just torched her career to keep my secret. I couldn't let her do it. I walked over to the duffel bag I had dropped on the floor, the bag I had packed to run away with. I knelt down, unzipping the inner lining, and pulled out the one thing I had sworn never to show anyone. It was a small, encrypted hard drive, cold and heavy in my palm. It contained the unredacted ledgers, the email chains, the proof that my signature had been forged by a partner I had trusted like a father. It was the truth, but it was also a grenade that would blow up my entire world, my family's legacy, the gallery's history, everything. "Sarah?" I said softly. She turned, her expression guarded. "I'm fine, Elena. Miller is just noise. I'll find another way to—" "Stop," I interrupted. I walked over to the table and set the drive down between us. It made a solid clack against the wood. "You don't have to quit, and you don't have to write a lie." Sarah looked at the drive, then up at me, confusion knitting her brow. "What is this?" "It's the story," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "The real one. It proves I didn't move the money. It proves I was the scapegoat." I took a breath, the air in the cabin feeling suddenly thin. "It clears my name, but it implicates people I've spent my whole life protecting." Once this is out, there's no going back. The gallery is dead. My old life is dead. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the metal casing of the drive. But she didn't pick it up. She looked at me with a fierce, terrifying intensity. Why give this to me? You could have leaked this anonymously. You could have saved yourself. I'm giving it to you because you're the only one who looked at me and didn't see a thief, I replied. Save your career, Sarah. Write the piece, but write the truth. She picked up the drive slowly, weighing it in her hand. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. Then she looked at her laptop, then back to me. I won't write the scandal, she said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register that vibrated in my chest. I'm not going to write a hit piece about a socialite falling from grace. I'm going to write a redemption arc. I'm going to write about how they tried to bury you and how you survived. She didn't wait for my permission. She sat down, plugged in the drive, and opened a new document. The sound of her typing wasn't violent this time. It was rhythmic, steady, a reconstruction rather than an execution. I poured 2 glasses of cheap red wine and set one beside her hand. I didn't leave. I sat on the rug near the wood stove, watching the firelight dance across her focused face. The fear of the future, of the fallout, the courts, the public scrutiny, began to recede, replaced by the comfort of the present. The cabin was warm, the wine was dark and rich, and for the first time, the silence between us wasn't filled with secrets. It was filled with trust. Sarah paused, her hand dropping from the keyboard to rest on my shoulder, her touch grounding and deliberate. She didn't speak, but her thumb traced the line of my collarbone, a silent promise that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The storm outside had passed, but the real shift had happened in here. I leaned into her touch, savoring the weight of it, and finally, I let myself breathe. The article published at dawn on a Tuesday. It wasn't the salacious, breathless takedown the tabloids had been salivating over. It was a surgical dismantling of the corruption that had framed me, written with a clarity that cut through the noise of the scandal like a scalpel. Sarah didn't just clear my name. She rewrote the narrative, shifting the focus from my alleged negligence to the systemic betrayal I had survived. Sarah lost her job before noon. Miller fired her via a text message that was more expletive than sentence, but it didn't matter. By evening, we were sitting on the floor of the cabin, toasting with the last of the cheap red wine. She had traded a steady paycheck for integrity, and she looked lighter for it. I never liked that office anyway, she murmured, tracing the rim of her glass with a lazy finger. The lighting was terrible for the soul. For me, the silence of the town changed texture. It didn't suddenly embrace me with parades, but the sharp edge of suspicion evaporated. The cashier at the grocery store finally made eye contact. The bartender at the Rusty Anchor nodded when we walked in. I wasn't the pariah anymore. I was just a neighbor with a complicated past. The legal battles would be fought in the city via aggressive Zoom calls and expensive lawyers, but my physical reality remained here, anchored to the granite and the gray ocean. I realized I didn't want to go back. The penthouse, with its glass walls and performative social circles, felt alien now. I wanted the drafty cabin. I wanted the smell of wood smoke in my hair and the rough, honest friction of the coast. Most of all, I wanted the woman who had seen me when I was invisible. We walked down to the harbor a month later. The weather was rare, clear, cold, the sky a piercing blue that reflected off the water. The air smelled of salt, a sensory echo of our beginning. You looked terrifying that night, I said, leaning into her side. The wind was still biting, but her coat was warm against my shoulder. Sarah smirked, sliding her hands into her pockets, her gaze tracking a seagull fighting the updraft. Terrifying? I was going for mysterious and alluring. You looked like you were going to arrest me or seduce me, and I wasn't sure which one I was hoping for. She laughed, the sound low and rich, vibrating against me. I think we managed both, in a way. I arrested your flight risk and... She trailed off, turning to face me. Her eyes were dark, amused, and full of that same intense focus that had unraveled me in the pub. The rest is on the record. I turned to her, blocking out the sea, blocking out the world. I'm not running, I said softly. I know, Sarah replied. She reached out, her hand cupping my jaw, her thumb brushing my cheekbone with a familiarity that made my heart ache. Neither am I. She kissed me then. It wasn't hidden in the fog or stolen in a cabin. It was right there in the open air, deliberate and unhurried. It tasted of the future. Complicated, sure, but ours. The kiss was a sultry confirmation of everything the silence had promised. It wasn't just affection, it was a claim, a public declaration that the lines we had crossed were never going to be redrawn. We turned away from the water and walked back toward the town, shoulder to shoulder, leaving the horizon behind us. We were exactly where we needed to be. If you enjoyed this story of high stakes and slow burns, subscribe to follow more journeys into the unexpected.